Simon Armitage is an English poet, playwright and novelist. Born in Huddersfield and now living in West Yorkshire, Simon Armitage was named Poet Laureate in 2019, and that is where he remains today. Armitage is a British poet, playwright and novelist, and is attuned to modern life and vernacular language. His poetry has been described as very accessible and revelatory. Known for his quite deadpan delivery, Armitage's formally assured, often darkly comic poetry is influenced by poets like Ted Hughes, W.H. Auden and Philip Larkin. In fact, Armitage himself has said, "If it was not for Ted Hughes and the impact that he had on me when I was in school, I may not have been turned on poetry at all." Armitage has been regarded as one of a handful of poets who showed that poetry could be both intelligent and popular, could be timeless and contemporary, could be streetwise and wise. It's important to note that this poem is based on a real testimony given by this ex-soldier, Guardsman Tromans, after he fought in Iraq in 2003. The interview with this soldier is particularly harrowing, and he emphasises how inside he is just constantly frightened. He talks about how war is not just physically traumatic, but mentally and emotionally, and how difficult it is to adjust to domesticated lifestyle having experienced such trauma. It's important to note that Armitage interviewed real-life veteran soldiers from different wars, including that from the Gulf War and the Iraq War, and perhaps the reference later to the Desert Sands reflects that of the Gulf War or the Iraq War. Reading Armitage is like being led into an arc of vowels, consonants, slang, world rhythms. He shepherds these into great stories and characters. Remember this as we read the poem later on. And finally, Armitage stated that poetry is a democratic art form that anybody can use to express their feelings, whether as a novice or an experienced writer. Keep this in mind as we read some of the lines from the poem today. Let's have a read of the poem.
On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road. Probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all three of us opened fire, three of a kind, all letting fly. And I swear, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story. Except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. Then I blink and he bursts through the doors of the bank. Sleep and he's probably armed, but possibly not. Dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle. Here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands.
We're now going to have a closer look at his poem line by line. But remember, this is not the only thing that can be said about this poem. There's so much more that you need to explore and have a real think about your own interpretation and analysis. This poem has a really interesting way of starting, on another occasion. Notice that it is written as a first-person monologue with the soldier as the speaker. The poem is told anecdotally and begins with "on another occasion," implying that this is a reoccurring experience. The nonchalance in the way in which this story is told just highlights that brutality of war even further. And this inclusive pronoun "we" does give a sense that they are one unity fighting together, but also emphasises how there is a loss of individual identity because the reality of war means that this is a soldier's duty to fight and potentially to die. Words like tackle, looters, legs it, they euphemize the killing. They make it seem almost normal. The language here is kind of childish. Again, it reminds us that this is just an ordinary person asked to perform such a traumatizing and extraordinary act of killing. The line, probably armed, possibly not, is the absolute crux of the poem. It comes quite early in the speaker's uncertain testimony that this looter was probably armed but possibly not. As we read on, I want you to think about this idea that the person who they're fighting may or may not have been armed. In the next line, we get more of the story here. Well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. It's almost like a chain reaction. It's as if they have ceased to be humans and manage only because they're now machines, where every action has a response. And that particular response here was to kill the man that was directly in front of them, who, let's remember, may or may not have had a gun on him. The language here is very conversational, very nonchalant and quite careless. Well, myself, somebody else, all of the same mind. When he says three of a kind, we again are reminded that these soldiers have no singular identity. They're all of one unit fighting because they're told they have to do so. The line from Charge of the Light Brigade, "Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die," kind of comes to mind here. Really try to picture the image that Armitage is creating here of the three men carelessly firing towards the unarmed man in front of them. It most definitely is not glorious, or in this case even justifiable, to the speaker or to us as the reader. Think about how Armitage is presenting war here. In the next few lines, we almost get a moment frozen in time as the soldier describes that particular moment of being able to see through the man's body from all of the gunfire. This disgusting and disturbing image perhaps suggests that even as war normalises or numbs people to extreme violence, life will never be the same for the speaker. It's quite interesting that he repeats, "I see, I see." It's very visual. It's like these images are going to haunt him for the rest of his life. He can see it now when he recounts it, he can see it in his mind, it's constantly there. Perhaps here he's repeating it to show that he just cannot make sense of the reality before him. We're really with the soldier here in this moment. Think particularly about the adjective rip and the idea he can see daylight through a man's body. The description is horrifyingly gruesome and really honest, further implying the brutal reality of war and its futility. In the next line, pain itself, the image of agony. Armitage adopts the grotesque imagery to emphasise the physical mangling of this body and the indifference shown to the victim at that moment of death. The horror of the shooting is amplified by this description of the other soldiers' casual reaction to it as they carelessly toss his guts back into his body. Perhaps it's normalised, perhaps he feels numb, but the description definitely dehumanises the victim and portrays him almost like cattle being disposed of without dignity or care. Again, we get the carelessness in the way in which he is carted off in the back of a lorry. It's desensitising the brutal image and the violence that they are committing on a daily basis. And in this moment, end of story, we almost get a sense of finality and we're almost taking a breath from the horrific image that's been painted before this. And then we get the line, except not really. It's quite overwhelming to know that there's more to this story, just like it is so overwhelming being the soldier fighting in the war themselves. The narrative shifts from anecdotal to confessional here, and we witness the mental deterioration of the poetic voice as he becomes increasingly more anxious. Think also about the sounds here. The sibilance shadow, stays, street is very much contrasted by the alliterative B in but I blink. Like the caesura and enjambment, it's really invasive and unpredictable. Notice also how this description is in the present tense. It kind of helps to convey a sense of immediacy for the reader, putting us at the scene and keeping the narrator there in his head, reliving that moment countless times. The blood is metaphorically still on this street, and every day he has to live with what he has done. This invasion is continued into the next line, where he bursts again through the doors of the bank. It's like it represents those shots coming at you from random moments, but also it's so invasive and attacking. It's like you're in the moment yourself through the sounds, through the language, and through the punctuation that Armitage has used. The repetition and the idea that he is sleep, probably armed, possibly not, dream, torn apart by a dozen rounds, again just shows how this just never goes away. He's haunted by what he does in his sleep and in his day, just again reiterating the struggle and inability to adapt to a life after war. The soldier admits here to turning to drink and drugs to try and get rid of the horrific things that he's seen and done. And that word flush is almost like he's trying to purify himself, get rid of all the toxic things in his life and in his thoughts. It's really overwhelming here. And the dreams and the flashbacks are equivalent to the PTSD that most soldiers suffer when coming back from war. The repetition in the poem and later in the poem, and this dream-fueled flashback indicates the reoccurring replaying of the fateful moments in the speaker's mind. Psychologically, we're really getting this internal conflict of the soldier. It's repeated, it's invasive, it's attacking the form, the style, and the imagery that Armitage creates in this poem. The focus of the first 4 stanzas is on the shooting, and the final 4 portray the relentless mental torture of the soldier when he returns home. Notice in these lines the alliterative H. It makes it sound heavy, as if the memory and the guilt the soldier feels is pounding inside his head. The sibilant, as mentioned previously, could be reference to the sandy deserts, but it also gives off a hissing sound. It's like the soldier is spitting the words in regret and anger as he recounts the stories. In the final line of the poem, we're brought back to the present moment, here and now, near to the knuckle, where the soldier recounts that his bloody life was in my bloody hands. To say you have blood on your hands metaphorically is a common idiom that means that you are responsible for the killing or the death of somebody. And here the poem is finally acknowledging that the speaker did play a role in the looter's death, even if the speaker was a part of a larger group of soldiers and it was his duty to do so at the time. The disturbing image of this blood on the hands and in his life again just shows how grotesque and violent war can be. And finally, the line ends quite abruptly, leaving no doubt that this soldier is not likely to recover mentally from the effects of his experience. I think it's fair to say that in this poem and through the soldier's account, Armitage is trying to portray how war is not glorious. Try also to reflect on the intention of the poet here. Are we supposed to feel sorry for this soldier who is clearly traumatised by what he's done? Do we dislike the way in which he gruesomely and carelessly destroyed somebody's life? Or are we angry and frustrated at the system which sent him there in the first place? Now let's have a think about the big ideas that we can identify within this poem. Again, there's so much that you can say here. So just use my next ones as examples before you have a think about your own. Remember also that we compare big ideas when we're looking at comparative poetry. We don't compare things line by line, and we definitely don't compare devices. Armitage presents the brutal reality of war. Armitage shows how soldiers become desensitised to the horrors of war. Armitage exposes a soldier's inability to adapt back into domesticated life and how they are affected by war. Armitage highlights the irrevocable psychological effects of war. Armitage suggests that, despite physical distance and time, the speaker is consumed with his powerful memories. Remember that we are constantly comparing big ideas as we read through the power and conflict cluster. Does, for example, Owens present the brutal reality of war? Or perhaps Rumans presents this desensitisation to war? Have a think and come up with some points of comparison between the poems that you've looked at so far. That's all we're going to look at in terms of his poem today, but I hope I have inspired you to think more about Armitage and the great poems that he writes. Please do remember that he is our current Poet Laureate, and he's come up with some brilliant contemporary poems that are very recent and current to today's life. Please do check them out.